In a neighborhood plagued by prejudice, young Isaiah sits silently on the steps of an abandoned house, harboring a secret that could unravel his family's tragic past. Officer Daniel, determined to uncover the truth behind the boy's enigmatic presence, finds himself entangled in a web of assumptions and biases that threaten to consume him. As the investigation deepens, both are forced to confront their own demons and the harsh realities of a flawed system. Will they find redemption in the shadows of their past, or will the truth remain buried forever? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Isaiah sat on the steps of the abandoned house every afternoon, like clockwork. His small, wiry frame hunched slightly forward, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze unwavering as it fixed on the weathered front door. The house, with its chipped paint and sagging porch, looked as though it had given up on being noticed, until Isaiah appeared. There was a certain stillness to him, a quiet persistence that had drawn the eyes of passers-by. He didn't fidget, didn't appear restless. He simply waited. To the neighbors, this behavior was strange. The old house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. People used to hurry past it, barely sparing it a second glance, but with Isaiah stationed on the steps every day, that indifference had turned into wary curiosity. Mrs. Henderson, who lived a few streets down, had taken to clutching her purse tighter whenever she drove past. "What's that boy doing there every day?" she muttered to her husband as they passed the house on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. "Nothing good, I'll tell you that." Similar whispers echoed through the neighborhood. A sense of unease began to creep into conversations at barbecues and coffee mornings. "He's just a kid," some would say, trying to dismiss the growing suspicion, but their words held no conviction. The truth was, Isaiah's presence on those steps stirred something in them, something they couldn't quite understand. Officer Daniel first noticed the boy while making his usual patrol rounds. A local police officer for over 15 years, Daniel knew this area well. It was quiet, predictable, people followed the rules here, and he liked that. But there was something about Isaiah that made his instincts flare, a small alarm that he couldn't quite shut off. At first, Daniel simply noted the boy sitting there. But as the days passed, his casual glances turned into focused attention. Each time he drove past, Isaiah was there, sitting in that same position, staring at the house. Daniel began to wonder what the boy was up to. His police training kicked in, flooding his mind with possible scenarios. Maybe the boy was scouting the area, waiting for the right moment to cause trouble. Or maybe he was a lookout for something shady going on inside the house. His mind spun with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Daniel decided to approach the boy one afternoon. Parking his patrol car a few houses down, he stepped out, his boots making heavy thuds on the pavement as he crossed the street. As he got closer, Isaiah didn't move. He didn't even look up. It was as though Daniel didn't exist in Isaiah's world. "Hey kid," Daniel called out, his tone friendly but with an edge of authority. "What are you doing here?" Isaiah finally lifted his head. His face was young, too young to be sitting alone on the steps of an abandoned house every day. His dark eyes were calm, almost unreadable, as they met Daniel's. "Just sitting," Isaiah said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "Just sitting?" Daniel repeated, folding his arms across his chest. "For hours? Every day?" Isaiah shrugged, his gaze drifting back to the front door of the house. "Yeah." Daniel's patience began to wear thin. He had seen kids loiter before, but there was something about Isaiah that gnawed at him. The boy wasn't causing any trouble, but his silence, the lack of explanation, was frustrating. There had to be more to it. "You waiting for someone?" Daniel pressed, his suspicion rising. Isaiah didn't respond right away. His eyes flickered slightly, as if considering the question, but he didn't look back at Daniel. "No." "Well, you can't just sit here like this every day. It's not your house. You understand that, right?" Isaiah finally stood up slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. He dusted off his pants and gave Daniel a long, measured look. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said quietly. His words were polite, but Daniel could feel the weight of something unspoken behind them. It wasn't defiance exactly, but a quiet confidence that unsettled Daniel. The boy wasn't backing down, but he also wasn't breaking any rules. It left Daniel in an uncomfortable gray area. As Isaiah walked away, Daniel watched him go, the knot in his stomach tightening. The boy hadn't given him a reason to stop him, but the unease Daniel felt wouldn't fade. What was he waiting for? Why that house? The following days saw Daniel's frustration grow. Each time he patrolled the area, Isaiah was back on those steps. Every interaction between them felt like a puzzle, one Daniel couldn't figure out. He found himself obsessing over the boy. There had to be something he was missing. At home, Daniel's thoughts were still dominated by Isaiah's quiet presence. His wife, Anna, noticed his distracted state. "You've been off lately," she commented one evening as they sat down for dinner. "Is something bothering you?" Daniel shook his head, but his thoughts were already miles away, back at the abandoned house. "There's this kid," he said slowly, pushing his food around on his plate. "He's just sitting on this old house's steps, every day, hours at a time. It's not normal." Anna raised an eyebrow. "Maybe he's just waiting for someone." "He says he's not, and he won't tell me why he's there," Daniel replied, his frustration seeping into his voice. "I've asked him, but he's like a wall. Nothing." Anna gave him a sympathetic smile. "Maybe he's got a reason that's none of our business. If he's not causing any harm." "I just don't get it," Daniel muttered. "It doesn't feel right." But despite Daniel's growing obsession, there was no rule against sitting on an abandoned house's steps. He knew that. Yet every fiber in his being told him Isaiah was there for a reason, one that wasn't innocent. As the weeks passed, Daniel's unease deepened, and with it, his determination to find out the truth about Isaiah. He began asking around the neighborhood, trying to gather pieces of the boy's story, but no one seemed to know much about him. Isaiah had recently moved into the area with his mother, that much was clear, but beyond that, the boy remained a mystery. His quiet, solitary presence unnerved people. "Maybe he's just a weird kid," one of Daniel's colleagues said when he mentioned it in passing. "Or maybe he's up to something," Daniel replied, more convinced than ever that he needed to dig deeper. He wasn't just going to let this go. Something about Isaiah in that house didn't sit right, and Daniel wasn't one to leave questions unanswered. Little did he know, the answers he sought would shake his world to its core. Daniel stood there, letting the boy's words hang in the air, the weight of them sinking in. "I'm waiting for my father." The simplicity of Isaiah's statement was disarming. Daniel blinked, thrown off by the unexpected honesty, or what seemed like honesty. There was something about the way Isaiah said it, the emotion that passed briefly across his face, that made Daniel pause. He wanted to believe it, but his skepticism was ingrained. Years of being a cop had trained him to question everything, and he wasn't about to let his guard down now. "Your father?" Daniel repeated, his tone still cautious, though the edge of suspicion softened just a little. Isaiah didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Yeah," he said quietly, as if that single word carried more weight than Daniel could ever understand. And perhaps it did, because behind that calm exterior there was something deeper. A pain that was carefully concealed, but there. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to decide how to approach this. He wasn't the type to let emotions sway him, but there was something in the boy's eyes that made it harder to stay objective. "What do you mean you're waiting for your father? Is he supposed to meet you here?" Daniel pressed, his voice gentler now, though the skepticism lingered just beneath the surface. Isaiah shook his head, the faintest trace of sadness flickering across his face. "He's not coming here. Not like that. But this is where I come to think about him." This was his house. The revelation hit Daniel harder than he expected. This crumbling, forgotten house had once been someone's home, a family's home. And now, here was this boy, sitting on its steps every day, waiting for something that seemed impossible. For a moment, Daniel's mind struggled to reconcile the image of Isaiah, silent, watchful, with the innocence of a kid just trying to hold on to some connection to a father who wasn't there. Still, Daniel's guard remained up. "So your father lived here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "But he's not around anymore?" Isaiah's eyes flickered with something Daniel couldn't quite identify. Grief, maybe, or frustration. "He disappeared," Isaiah said quietly, "years ago. I don't know where he is. But my mom said this house was his home when he was a kid. So I come here to feel close to him, to think. I don't know. Maybe I thought if I waited long enough." His voice trailed off, and for the first time since Daniel had met the boy, Isaiah's composure seemed to crack. Just for a second, but it was enough for Daniel to see the raw emotion underneath. The boy wasn't just sitting on those steps out of some strange habit, he was searching for something. Hope, connection, closure. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. He wasn't good at dealing with emotion, especially not the kind that came from wounds so deep. He knew what loss felt like. He'd seen it enough in his line of work, but hearing it come from Isaiah, a boy so young, made it feel different. Personal, somehow. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. The neighborhood had seen its share of trouble in the past, and it was his job to keep it safe. He couldn't let a kid's sad story cloud his judgment. "Isaiah," Daniel started, his tone soft but firm, "I get that you're hurting, but sitting on these steps every day, it's got people worried. They don't understand why you're here, and you have to admit, it's not exactly normal." Isaiah's expression hardened slightly, the walls going back up. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "I'm just sitting, thinking." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't want this to turn into another confrontation, but he couldn't ignore the fact that the boy's presence was causing a stir in the neighborhood. "I get that, but people are talking, they think." He hesitated, unsure of how to phrase it without sounding accusatory. "They think something's off, and it's my job to make sure nothing is." Isaiah's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Because I'm black, right?" The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. There was no hint of hesitation in his voice now, no trace of the quiet, reflective boy who had spoken about his father just moments ago. Daniel felt his stomach drop, a wave of guilt washing over him. He'd seen this before, the assumptions, the suspicions, all based on nothing more than someone's skin color. But this was different. He wasn't like those people, the ones who jumped to conclusions because of prejudice. He was just trying to do his job, to protect the neighborhood. But as the boy's words hung between them, Daniel couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth in what Isaiah was saying. "That's not what this is about," Daniel said quickly, though the defensiveness in his voice surprised even him. "I'm just trying to keep the peace. You've got to understand how it looks. A kid sitting outside an abandoned house every day." Isaiah's expression didn't soften. "And what if I was white? Would you be standing here asking me the same questions?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know how to answer that. It wasn't a question he was prepared for, and for the first time in a long time, he found himself questioning his own motivations. Was he treating Isaiah differently because of his race? He didn't want to believe that, but the doubt gnawed at him. Before Daniel could gather his thoughts, Isaiah turned and started walking down the sidewalk, his shoulders tense, but his stride steady. "You don't get it," he said over his shoulder, his voice cold. "You never will." Daniel watched him go, a strange heaviness settling over his chest. There were so many things he wanted to say, but none of them seemed right. He didn't want to be the bad guy here, but somehow that's exactly what he had become in Isaiah's eyes. As Isaiah disappeared down the street, Daniel stood there for a long moment, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He had come here expecting to find answers, but all he'd found were more questions. About Isaiah, about his own actions, about the assumptions he didn't even realize he had been making. When Daniel finally climbed back into his patrol car, he didn't feel the same sense of certainty he had felt earlier. Instead, he felt conflicted, torn between the need to do his job and the uncomfortable realization that maybe he had been wrong about Isaiah all along. As he drove away from the old house, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. There was more to Isaiah's story, more to the boy's quiet determination to wait on those steps. And for the first time, Daniel found himself wondering not what Isaiah was hiding, but what he himself had been blind to. The more Daniel dug into Isaiah's past, the heavier his heart became. What started as a vague curiosity had morphed into a search for truth, one that revealed just how wrong he had been. Every time he thought about Isaiah sitting alone on those steps, Daniel couldn't help but feel a deepening sense of guilt. The story of the boy's father was a painful one. marked by injustice and prejudice, and it was one that Isaiah had carried with him every day, in every moment of silence on that porch. The first real clue came from Mrs. Clark, an elderly woman who lived just 2 houses down from the abandoned home. She had been there long enough to remember when the house wasn't just a shadow of what it had once been. Mrs. Clark was one of the few in the neighborhood who didn't seem threatened by Isaiah. In fact, she felt sorry for him. "He sits there because of his daddy," Mrs. Clark explained one evening when Daniel knocked on her door. She leaned against the frame, her frail hands shaking as she adjusted her shawl. That house was his father's home. His daddy grew up there, and it was a good family once. But things changed. Daniel had heard bits and pieces of the story by then, but Mrs. Nat Clark's version filled in the gaps. She told him how Isaiah's father, Richard, had been a well-liked young man with a promising future. But all that promise was cut short the day he was accused of a crime. One that would haunt him and his family for years. "They said he was involved in a robbery," Mrs. Clark said, her eyes clouded with the memory. "But those of us who knew him, we never believed it. Richard wasn't the kind of boy to get mixed up in something like that. He was a good son and a good man." Daniel listened quietly, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. This was the part of the story that no one had told him before. Richard had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a combination of circumstances and prejudices had led to his arrest. The evidence against him had been flimsy, but in a community eager to point fingers, no one questioned it. Richard had spent months in jail awaiting trial, and during that time his reputation had been torn apart. But the worst part came after the trial, when Richard was acquitted. The damage had already been done. People didn't forget, and despite the court's ruling, the whispers continued. The family had been shattered by the ordeal. Richard, humiliated and unable to find work because of the stigma, disappeared soon after. Some said he left to escape the shame. Others speculated that he had gone into hiding because the law still had its eyes on him, waiting for him to slip up. In truth, no one knew where he had gone, not even his wife and son. Daniel found himself struggling with the story. This was no longer just about a boy sitting on an old porch. It was about the heavy weight of injustice that had been passed down to Isaiah, an inheritance of pain, misunderstanding, and longing. Isaiah's mother, from what Daniel learned, had done her best to keep things together after Richard's disappearance. She had raised Isaiah on her own, but it hadn't been easy. The house, with all its memories, had been left to rot, a ghost of what it had once been. And Isaiah had grown up without the answers he so desperately needed. It wasn't hard to understand now why Isaiah came to that house every day. It was a place where he could feel close to his father, where he could wait in silence for a man who might never return, but who lived on in his son's heart. The more Daniel learned, the more conflicted he became. How had he been so blind? How had he let his own assumptions cloud his judgment? He had come to Isaiah with the same suspicions that had condemned Richard all those years ago, and that realization hit him harder than any confrontation ever could. But as he continued to ask around, another piece of the puzzle began to emerge, one that made Daniel question more than just his own actions. There had been rumors, long buried but still whispered in dark corners, that Richard's arrest hadn't been an accident. Some said he had been set up, framed by people who didn't want to see a young black man succeed in their town. Others claimed that the police at the time had been complicit, looking the other way when the evidence didn't add up. Daniel felt sick as he listened to these stories. He wanted to dismiss them, to tell himself that this was all in the past, that things had changed. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that some things hadn't changed at all. Isaiah's words echoed in his mind again. "You don't get it. You never will." Daniel had tried to brush off the boy's accusations, to tell himself that he wasn't like those people, that he wasn't part of the problem. But now, as the truth came into focus, he realized that he had been wrong. He had been blind to his own biases, blind to the ways in which his assumptions had colored his view of Isaiah from the start. The neighborhood's suspicions about Isaiah weren't based on anything the boy had done. They were based on fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of difference, fear of what Isaiah represented. And Daniel had let himself be swept up in that fear, instead of seeing Isaiah for who he really was. A kid looking for answers, for connection, for some kind of closure. As the pieces of the story fell into place, Daniel knew he had to do something. He couldn't just walk away from this, not now. He had to make things right, not just for Isaiah, but for himself. For too long, he had been part of a system that had failed Isaiah's father, and now it was failing Isaiah too. But how could he make amends? What could he possibly say to a boy who had every reason to distrust him? The next day, Daniel found himself driving back to the old house. Isaiah was there, as always, sitting quietly on the steps, his gaze fixed on the door. This time, Daniel didn't approach with suspicion. He didn't come with questions or accusations. Instead, he walked over to the steps and sat down beside Isaiah. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding, of unspoken truths. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I talked to Mrs. Clark," he said quietly. "She told me about your father, about what happened." Isaiah didn't say anything, but Daniel could feel the tension in the boy's posture. He didn't expect Isaiah to respond right away. He had learned enough to know that trust wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn. "I didn't understand before," Daniel continued, his voice low. "I was wrong about a lot of things, and I'm sorry for how I treated you." Isaiah glanced at him, his expression guarded. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I've been blind to a lot of things. I thought I was doing my job, but I was just making assumptions. About you, about your father. And I realize now that those assumptions were wrong." Isaiah looked away, his gaze returning to the house. "It doesn't matter," he said softly. "None of this will bring him back." Daniel's heart ached at the quiet resignation in the boy's voice. He wished he could fix things, that he could undo the damage that had been done. But he couldn't. All he could do was try to be better, to do better. "Maybe not," Daniel said gently, "but I can help. I can help you find out what really happened to him." Isaiah's eyes flickered with surprise, but he didn't respond. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told Daniel everything he needed to know. For the first time, there was hope. A small flicker, but hope nonetheless. And for Isaiah, after years of silence and waiting, that was enough. Officer Daniel had always prided himself on his dedication to the badge. He'd grown up in a neighborhood much like the one he patrolled now, where authority meant everything. To him, it was about protection and order. But with that came a belief in the righteousness of his own perspective. As he sat in his car, parked a few houses down from the abandoned one where Isaiah spent his afternoons, the boy's quiet demeanor gnawed at him. It had become an obsession. Each day he watched from a distance, his mind churning with questions and assumptions. Why did he come here? What was he hiding? He believed he was doing his job, enforcing safety in the community. Yet the more he observed, the more he felt an unsettling disquiet. Was it truly concern for the neighborhood, or something more insidious? He tried to rationalize his actions, convincing himself that every moment he spent watching was a service to the people. One evening, after a particularly long shift, he stumbled upon a file in the department that had been gathering dust. It contained information on Isaiah's father, a man named Joseph King, whose name had crossed his desk more than once. As he scanned through the report, his heart began to race. The details were shocking. Joseph had been falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. A victim of systemic racism, he had been profiled because of the color of his skin, a narrative all too familiar in a society that often judged based on appearance rather than character. The implications were staggering. Officer Daniel felt the weight of guilt pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. How could he have missed this? He'd been so consumed with his own fears and prejudices that he hadn't bothered to seek the truth. The realization struck him with the force of a tidal wave, leaving him breathless. Joseph had been a good man, wronged by the very system he had pledged to uphold. Haunted by this revelation, Officer Daniel found himself driving to the abandoned house the next day. The sun shone brightly, but it did little to illuminate the darkness he felt inside. He approached Isaiah, who was once again perched on the steps, the boy's silhouette framed against the crumbling facade. For a moment, Daniel hesitated, the weight of his badge feeling heavier than ever. "Isaiah?" he began, his voice unsteady. The boy looked up, surprise flashing across his face, quickly replaced by caution. "I need to talk to you." Isaiah remained silent, his expression unreadable. Daniel took a breath, his heart racing as he fought against the instinct to retreat. "How do you apologize for a lifetime of prejudice?" "I've been watching you," he continued, trying to sound casual, but his sincerity was evident. "And I realized I've been wrong about you." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" His voice was soft, laced with confusion and suspicion. "I thought you were trouble," Daniel admitted, feeling vulnerable as he stripped away the armor he had worn for so long. "I didn't understand why you were here, but I've learned about your father. What happened to him? He was innocent." Isaiah's eyes widened, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "You know about my dad?" His voice trembled, revealing a longing that had been buried deep. "Yes," Daniel replied, stepping closer, his heart racing. "He was a good man, a victim of a system that failed him. I've let my own biases blind me. I'm sorry for what I put you through, for what I assumed about you." Isaiah studied him, the boy's expression shifting from suspicion to a guarded curiosity. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I want to make it right," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to help you find the truth about your father, about what happened. You deserve to know. You deserve justice." For the first time, Isaiah saw a glimmer of humanity in the officer. Perhaps this man who had once stood as an obstacle in his life could become an ally. Slowly, he nodded, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not just about me. It's about everyone who thought the same way you did." Daniel nodded, understanding the gravity of Isaiah's words. This was a turning point not just for the boy, but for himself as well. In this moment of vulnerability, a bond began to form between them, built on shared pain and a mutual desire for redemption. As they stood there, a new understanding blossomed. Officer Daniel felt a shift within him. The prejudices he had harbored began to crumble, replaced by a determination to fight for justice. No longer would he allow fear and bias to dictate his actions. He would not just serve the community. He would seek to understand it. Together they would uncover the truth behind Isaiah's father's disappearance, embarking on a journey that would reshape both their lives and the lives of those around them. In the light of this newfound connection, Daniel could finally see the shadows of his past begin to recede, making way for the promise of a brighter future. A future where justice was not just an ideal, but a reality they would strive to achieve together. The air was thick with anticipation as Officer Daniel and Isaiah stood at the threshold of the abandoned house. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the dilapidated structure, a stark contrast to the darkness that had once clouded their lives. With every step they took, a sense of purpose filled the air, a determination to uncover the truth that had long been buried beneath layers of prejudice and fear. As they pushed open the creaky door, dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through the broken windows. The interior was a labyrinth of memories, remnants of a life that had once thrived here. Isaiah stepped inside, his heart racing with both excitement and trepidation. This was his father's childhood home, a place where joy had once resonated, now cloaked in silence and neglect. "Where do we start?" Daniel asked, glancing around the room, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon them. "I don't know," Isaiah replied, his voice tinged with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Maybe my dad left something behind." They began to search the house, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. With each creak of the floorboards, Isaiah felt a connection to his father, as if the very walls whispered secrets long forgotten. Daniel, too, felt an emotional shift. The boy's quest for closure had become his own, intertwining their fates in ways he had never imagined. After what felt like hours of searching, Isaiah discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard in the living room. His hands trembled as he pried it open, revealing a small, dust-covered box. Inside, they found letters. His father's letters. Isaiah's heart raced as he carefully unfolded the yellowed paper, his father's familiar handwriting leaping to life. "Dear Isaiah," he read aloud, tears welling in his eyes. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not there with you. I want you to know that I love you and your mother more than anything. I had to leave to keep you safe from a world that often misjudges based on the color of our skin, but I never stopped thinking of you, and I have faith that you will find your way back to the truth." Daniel watched Isaiah's face transformed, the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. "He loved me," Isaiah whispered, the realization washing over him like a warm embrace. "He never wanted to abandon us." The letters detailed his father's struggles, the fear he felt, and the hope that one day justice would prevail. With each word, they uncovered not just a narrative of a man wronged, but the legacy of resilience and love that had been passed down to Isaiah. "This is powerful," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your father was a hero, fighting against a system that tried to silence him. We need to share this." Isaiah nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "We have to tell everyone what really happened. It's not just about me anymore. It's about my dad and all the others who suffered like him." With a newfound sense of purpose, they left the abandoned house, carrying the letters like a torch illuminating their path. As they stepped out into the fading light, Daniel felt the weight of his badge transform. No longer was it a symbol of authority. It had become a tool for change, a means to uplift those who had been silenced. Over the following weeks, Daniel worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light. He met with community leaders, organized town hall meetings, and shared Isaiah's father's story, shining a light on the injustices that had long been swept under the rug. The more he spoke, the more the community began to listen. The people who had once whispered in fear now stood united, advocating for justice and change. Isaiah, too, became an integral part of this movement. He spoke at local schools, sharing his father's story and encouraging other kids to embrace their identity and stand against prejudice. The boy who once sat in silence on the steps of an abandoned house was now a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those still living in the shadows. As the community rallied together, changes began to take root. New initiatives were launched to combat racial profiling and discrimination, and the police department started workshops aimed at addressing biases among officers. Daniel, now a fierce advocate for justice, found himself at the forefront of these efforts, forging a new path for himself and his colleagues. Months passed, and the once divided community began to heal. The story of Joseph King became a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the consequences of prejudice and the importance of understanding. Isaiah stood proud, knowing his father's legacy was not only alive but thriving in the hearts of those who had come together to fight for justice. On a warm afternoon, as the sun set in a brilliant display of color, Isaiah found himself once again on the steps of the abandoned house, though this time it felt different. It was no longer a place of sorrow, but one of remembrance and hope. He was no longer alone. Daniel stood beside him, a friend and ally. "Do you think he's watching us?" Isaiah asked softly, glancing at the sky. "I do," Daniel replied, a smile breaking across his face. "He's proud of you." Isaiah smiled back, feeling the warmth of connection envelop him. "And I'm proud of what we've done together." As they sat there, the weight of the past lifted, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. Together, they had transformed pain into purpose, and in doing so, had woven a narrative of redemption that would resonate for generations to come. The power of karma had shown itself in the most unexpected ways, reminding them both that even in the darkest of times, light can emerge if only we choose to seek it. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.